Alright, if you are watching this video, you are watching from my public YouTube channel. I'm very happy to have you here. This is the Ascension of Babylon, and what we talk about is the occult. We talk about spiritual self-development, and I share my personal experiences with you so you can have a deeper, more tangible understanding of who you are. And it is truly my intention to initiate a remembrance within my audience, a remembrance of what you truly are beyond the human character, so you can exist as the human character, but your higher self at the same time. And in my opinion, that's truly what it means to be authentic. But anyways, getting right into it, I'm going to be talking about how working with spirits has completely changed my life. And I'm going to be getting into, basically the story of my life so you can see how much I have completely shifted. Now, just jumping right into it, since I was a teenager and even well before that, I was very, very troubled. So when I was a teenager, I went to juvenile lockup, not once, not twice, but many times. I was in the streets. I was committing crimes. I was hanging with the wrong crowd. I didn't really have a relationship with my family. I held a lot of anger towards my family, and this is something that began in early childhood, and it actually began with my adoptive mother giving me up and putting me up for adoption. And she didn't want to harm me, she didn't want to hurt me, but this left this like internal wound that I carried with me a majority of my life until I became aware of it, and I began releasing the trapped energy that was essentially a byproduct of this wound that, once again, I spent a majority of my life very unconscious of. And it was creating circumstances, it was creating relationships, it was creating mindsets, perceptions, identities, and belief systems that I wasn't necessarily aware of. So, during my teenage years, I got into a lot of trouble. I started getting into violent crime. I lived a lot of those years with my clothes in a backpack, abusing substances, harming other people, and things of that nature. When I was old enough to go to county jail, I did, and I went to county jail for the charges of robbery, and I almost also lost my life. So what ended up happening is me and a group of friends at the time, we went to set up this dude, and we were gonna rob him for drugs and things of that nature. And it basically went bad. It did not go as planned. The guy was able to get back in his vehicle, and when he did that, he ran me over in his vehicle, ran over the whole right side of my body. I looked like a piece of pizza that was like that you like rip the cheese off. That's what I looked like when I had somebody like show me myself. So essentially right now I'm taking you back to a scene where I'm in the hospital bed. I'm in the most pain I've ever been through in my life, and I wanted to see what I looked like. And the nurse said, "You don't want to do that." And the person who was visiting me at the time, I said, "No, show me." So she basically, took her phone and took a picture, and I looked at myself, and yeah, I looked really bad. My skin was like peeled off, never mind my bones being completely broken. I lost my tooth, all of these things, but my skin was like, I remember it being like fluid almost, like it was like watery, and I was sticking to the bed. So every time I would try to move, it felt like my skin was peeling off even more. I had almost lost my life. I was in the ER for a while, and then I spent, a very long time going through rehabilitation because I broke my leg in two spots, my pelvis, my collarbone. I believe I fractured some other things, and even after that, they didn't diagnose me with any brain damage, but it felt like I had brain damage because I would get disorientated in the middle of the day where I would like lose my balance. And forget where I was like going sometimes. Like I'd be walking down the street that I was familiar with, and I would almost like lose track of where I was. It was the most bizarre thing to go through. So, anyways, I got, robbery gone bad, ran over by vehicle, almost lost my life. And then shortly after, I actually ended up going to county jail as soon as I was old enough for them to throw me in there. You would think that I would change my life after this. I didn't. I got a lot worse. The crimes I was committing got even violenter. I became more violent as a person. I was putting myself at risk. Constantly had warrants for my life. Constantly had warrants for my arrest, and I was putting my life in danger constantly. So this led me to living a majority of my adulthood being incarcerated, and actually eventually I ended up in state prison. I was a gang member, so I was living the gang life. In prison and in jail, I was known as like a very, very violent person. I was constantly assaulting other people or taking other people out. And what that means in like jail lingo is I was the guy that, if you violated the rules, or, you were a rat, or you were a rapist, or, you were an enemy to like the set, I was gonna, basically assault you, or worse. I've stabbed people up. I'm gonna show you some things, and this is all leading to something. So here's a gentleman that I got into it with, and basically, I assaulted this person. This is what I used to assault him with. So this is a broom, and that's a soap and a sock. This is a weapon that I used to use a lot. They actually used to call me Soap Sock Swerve because, I was known to like use that weapon. That was the weapon that I liked to use. But what I'm conveying to you is I was completely lost. I was completely gone. Even when I was incarcerated, rather than trying to reform myself, I was just going crazy, and I was trying to hurt others, and I was always getting into these fights, and I was always, getting caught with weapons and things of that nature. I was very committed to this false identity that I had created for myself. So the tattoos that you see on my body, these are all like, or a majority of them are actually gang tattoos, and tattoos that I got when I was in the joint, when I was incarcerated. So I lived a lot of my life just living a very dangerous lifestyle, harming others, abusing substances, and things of that nature. And I don't know anyone that's been able to walk away from the lifestyle that was in as deep as I was, that essentially was able to step away from that and walk away from that and actually make something of themselves like I'm doing today. I mean, I have 360 turned around my entire existence. I've actually quantum leaped into a completely different timeline than I was existing in. And this all actually started by me working with different entities. So I was released from prison about 3 years ago, a little more than 3 years ago. And during this time, I started working with spirits heavy. I started working with spirits in a very committed way. And this kind of ignited this fire inside of me to where I started to view myself in the reality that I was existing in a lot different than I was used to viewing it. And I was always a little more self-aware than, the people that were in my gang, or, the people that I was around since I was younger. But I was consciously choosing to be very, very destructive. But as I started working with these spirits in this very committed way while I was incarcerated, I almost couldn't ignore, what I was seeing about myself and what I was seeing in relation to the reality that I was so accustomed to existing in. And slowly but surely, I started building this momentum, kind of like a snowball that's rolling down a hill. it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like every time I perform these different rituals and call these entities into my body through the practice of what is known as invocation, there was just more and more momentum that I was building until I reached this point where I kind of made this inner commitment with myself while I was incarcerated. About halfway through, I told myself that when I got out, I was going to completely change my life. And I did. Now, when I was in there and I was performing these different rituals, I was still getting in a lot of trouble. Actually, right before I went to state prison for the last 9 months of my bid, I actually stabbed somebody up really, really bad. But, even before the things happened that led up to that, I was becoming much more humble. Um, and I was just really shifting as a person, although I still did have my ways to me. And if you fucked with me or you crossed me, I was probably gonna poke you up or at the very least try to fight you or, hit you with a soap in a sock or something like that because I was conditioned in this way that if you fucked with me, I was gonna show you what's up and I was going to harm you, and I was going to let you know why they called me Swerve Loke. So what it means to swerve on somebody is you're just, you're really quick to move, and you're really quick to be violent. And that was a name that I had earned. That was a name that my homies began to call me, and people began to refer to me as. And it was a part of this identity that I had spent years kind of inflating and blowing up. And what this actually was, this wasn't me, but this was a protective adaptation that I had formed in response to what I was really feeling, you know, deep down. And that was trauma. That was anger. That was abandonment. That was fear even, right? I don't care how tough somebody thinks they are. When you're in the streets, there's a fear. Just the harder the criminal or the harder the gang member or the harder the gangster just means we're better at bypassing that fear and stuffing it down and kind of putting on this tough guy act to the world. But deep down, if you're in those circumstances, there is going to be a fear that's there, and you're most likely doing things to try to like avoid that. And I was constantly in this energy of fight or flight where I had to look over my shoulder, starting from when I was a teenager. I always had to look over my shoulder for the cops. And then I started committing violent crimes, so I had to look over my shoulder for like retaliation in relation to those things that I was doing. Then when I was also like in the juvenile lockup system, so I was getting into fights with other kids then. Then this led to me being in and out of adult jail. And so same thing, I'm getting into fights. I have to look over my shoulder. I don't know if someone's gonna try to take me out or what's going on, but I was always on edge and I was always like living in this space of fight or flight. And this is how I spent a majority of my life. And I had to unwire that fight or flight from my body, which was an entire process of healing and release that I had to go through that working with these different spirits actually led me into at some point. So going back to being incarcerated, or going back to being incarcerated, excuse me, this is when I really started getting the ball rolling. I really started working with a lot of these different entities, a lot of which who were associated with death, very ancient primal gods and goddesses, and I'm going to be showing you some of my altar plaques at some point in this video. But working with these forces completely began to shift me. I started seeing through the veils. I started seeing people for who they truly were. I started seeing myself for who I truly was. And yeah, so this led to me completely shifting gears, completely changing my reality, and actually me being released from prison after 4 years and making significant changes in my life. Now, when I came home from prison, I was by no means perfect. I had a lot that I needed to work through. I had lived in this, sorry about that, my apologies. My phone ran out of room, so I had to delete some stuff. But yeah, anyways, so when I came home from prison, I was no mean perfect. I had a lot of stuff that I had to work through. I, had this energy of fight or flight that was literally stored in my body. And this made it very difficult for me to function in society. I had a lot of anger. I had a lot of anxiety. I was extremely institutionalized, not just from the last 4 years that I did, but all of the other bids that I've been doing literally since I was a teenager. This is well over 10 years of being incarcerated. So there was a lot that I needed to work through, but I was very committed to my spiritual self-development. Even though I wasn't perfect, I was in a very abusive relationship where the other person was abusive towards me. I was abusive towards the other person. We were certainly not a good mix. There's a lot of really bad circumstances that came from us being together, and I had left the joint with a significant substance abuse problem to Suboxone. And the reason why I started doing this, I didn't use those types of drugs when, I had my freedom and when I was on the streets. It wasn't really my thing. But it was easy to get in when you're incarcerated. So I actually began doing Suboxone pretty much every single day, to the point that if I didn't have it, I would actually withdraw. So that's actually something I had to work through when I came home. And I was able to stop using the Suboxone, but I was bypassing it with other substances like marijuana. I was smoking a lot of cigarettes. I was drinking a lot of liquor. And, I was struggling with addiction. This is something I was having a really hard time with. And it's something that I certainly had to work through. And I did. Eventually I stopped abusing substances, I stopped smoking cigarettes, and I stopped smoking marijuana. And I built a much healthier relationship with my shadow aspects that were actually fueling the addictions. And I started to do this as I realized I was going through the process of what is known as clepothic initiation. And clepothic initiation is when we are facing our shadow parts in an intensified way, a much more intense way than the average person is going to experience it. And you're bringing up all of this trauma that's stored in the body, all of this trauma that's stored in the unconscious, and you're bringing it up to the conscious forefront so you can work with it in whatever way it manifests. So this is going to be heavy emotions. This is going to be certain mindsets that could be very dark, and what you're doing is experiencing your shadow parts. And this is also going to be physical manifestations of this energy that are actually becoming very solidified in your life through people, through places, through circumstances. And this is why it could be so difficult. It's because you're staring your shadow in the face through these physical mediums in which it's manifesting. And this could be enemies, this could be problems in your relationship, this could be a wide plethora of physical manifestations. And this is a primal form of soul development. This is the more modern way of looking at it, but this is actually in association with some of the most ancient forms of spiritual self-development that there actually are. And this is why when we look at mythology, there's always stories about either a god or a goddess or like a great hero, a human, who is going into the underworld and facing their shadow in the very same way that I had to face my shadow to learn how to find the light within those shadows and to actually shift into a completely different version of myself. So this is the process of development that I eventually became aware of, and it all started with these spirits that I was working with. And when we're working with these darker evolutionary forces, we can find ourselves going through these spiritual initiations that, when I say spiritual, I want you to understand it's very much physical, But yeah, it all started with me working with these spirits, and I started doing this in a very committed way when I was incarcerated. And this is what kind of created this snowball effect to where I started going through this very primal form of soul development, where I was working with a lot of death energy, and I was being forced to let go of that old identity that I was very attached to so I could embrace a new sense of self, a new reality and the new timeline that I currently exist in today. As these spiritual initiations began to get more and more intense, I began to educate myself in a much deeper way than I already understood on trauma and on psychology. And I realized that I had all of this trauma in my system that was actually running me on a subconscious level, and I wasn't really fully aware of it before, and I wasn't aware of how this trauma was creating all of these different patterns and all of these different themes to manifest in my life that were in direct association with the earliest days of my existence, where my mother gave me up, where my mother put me up for adoption. And although she didn't want to hurt me, this led me to a life of crime. It led me to not having a healthy relationship with my adoptive parents. It led me to a lot of the conflicts that I created for in my life, and the incarceration and stuff like that. And I realized that my incarceration was just a physical manifestation and reflection of how I felt inside for such a long time. I felt trapped. I felt like I couldn't be myself. I felt unsafe, I felt lonely, and I felt very, very angry. So what I did is I projected that outwards in the form of the reality that I had experienced for so long. And it's these darker occult initiations that made me aware of what was actually going on in my system, so I could face it head on and release these energies that were creating these patterns for me and that were locking me in a timeline that I no longer desired to exist in, a timeline where dead or incarceration for the rest of my life was very, very likely. And I know plenty of people that are spending their entire lives incarcerated, or they're in the ground. They're not here anymore. I know plenty of people who are dead. They're gone. They're, probably reincarnated or something like that. But the point is death or in jail was the reality that I was certainly headed for. But when I started working with these spirits, it created this momentum to where I completely shifted. But I had to go through a process of release. I had to release the illusions. I had to die to the identity that I created. I had to work through some really, really heavy emotions that were in association with not only trauma that I went through in some of the earliest days of my existence with my mother, but trauma that I built over my entire life. I built this entire trauma-based energetic resonance inside of my system, and I created this identity to avoid it. So as I started dying to that identity, what also happened is this trauma that I had bottled away began coming up. And this was not easy to work with, and it would manifest physically. I went through a lot of problems in my life for a while, and I worked through a lot of catalysts that was actually the physical manifestation of that trauma, giving me the opportunity to karmically resolve a lifetime buildup of suppressed emotional resonance and suppressed negative energy in general. And that's what working through the clip-off will actually do. You're working through a lifetime buildup of trauma-based energetic resonance in a much shorter time than it, takes you to build it up. And this is why these initiations can be so intense. It's kind of like going to the gym and, trying to get as fit as you can in a couple of years, rather than being like the bodybuilder that gets there over like 10 years or over a much longer period of time. It's kind of like that. It's a very intense emotional, mental, and spiritual workout. But all of this began while I was incarcerated. This momentum that I've built up to eventually shift me into a totally different version of myself in a totally different timeline, it all began with working with different entities. So to give you an idea, here is Baal Hadad. This was an altar print that I had on a makeshift altar that I used to keep in my cell. This is Chemosh. This is a very ancient primal force. This is Horon. This is a god of magic in the underworld from the Canaanite belief system, the Canaanite culture. This is Beelzebub. This is Reshef. So this is basically an underworld force, but he has many other associations as well. And I have other altar prints right now, or other altar prints in my drawer, but I'm not going to get them right now, is what I wanted to say. But this is where it all started. Me doing these different rituals with very limited supplies and very limited education of what I was doing at a metal desk inside of my cell, not knowing if I was about to get, 15 to 20 years or 10 years. I was looking at a lot of time. I was incarcerated for a drive-by shooting. I was being charged with multiple firearms, and I had even picked up another case for what I showed you here. I got into this huge, fight, and the guy got really injured, and it was this big gang fight inside of the day room, and they decided to charge me criminally, and then they indicted me on those charges as well. And I was looking at a lot of time, and I actually did magic to basically lessen the time to the best of my ability, and to basically create, or not create, but move into the best possible timeline that I could in relation to the charges that I was facing and stuff like that. And it absolutely worked. I absolutely did, because before I did that, my lawyer was trying to get me to take 10 to 12 years as if that was like a good thing. He made it sound like that's all we could really do, because I was an armed career criminal. I was a very known offender. And even in the joint, I wasn't calming down or chilling out or trying to like put a positive image for myself. I was breaking broomsticks over people's heads, and I was always fighting, and the DA knew this, and they looked at me as a menace to society. But working with spirit provided the momentum that I needed to completely shift into a different reality, and now my life is so different. It's like that version of myself is almost like a distant memory. Like, I still feel emotions that are associated with that old version of me. Sometimes there's still grieving that I need to go through, because I changed so fast. It's almost like standing over an old version of me and putting that version of me to rest. There's a lot of memories and a lot of experiences that are attached to that version of me. And there are times where certain emotions come up for me to kind of feel them and release them. And sometimes that does come with some grief. I worked really hard to be the person that I am today. And the point of this entire video is this started with me working with spirits inside of a cell, inside of a jail, and inside of a prison. And it ripple effect into me being the person that I am today. So this is how spirits completely changed my life. I'm a completely different person. I have a completely different self-concept than I used to the point it feels like, I almost can't believe that I was ever that person. I mean, I think about the stuff that I've done to people and the lifestyle that I used to live, and it's like, wow, I can't even fathom being that person anymore, because I'm nothing like that old version of myself. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate every single one of you. I'm used to making videos on TikTok. I just started making these YouTube videos. So if I stammer or stutter a little bit, it's just a part of me learning how to make this long form content. Or if I say something, it is what it is. I'm not going to edit it. I'm going to keep it authentic. And yeah, I appreciate every single one of you, and I will catch you in the next video. Thank you so much.